Okay, this is episode 15, and we have Jonah Locksley with us. Jonah is a cultural historian. He runs the blogs The Thinker's Garden and Jeffrey's Almanack. And these blogs focus on the overlooked and outré aspects of literature, arts, and history. Jonah, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. You're very welcome to spiritbox. So we've had a bit of a preamble on what we were going to discuss today, and you put forward the idea of magic, spirits, and matters of state, referencing the idea of angels that rule nations or ages, the demonic power of mob thought and rule, and the use of sorcery by governments and individuals to influence populations. So I'm really excited to hear more about this. You spoke about a CIA document that's being released recently through Freedom of Information Act. Maybe we can talk about that later. But let's talk about magic, spirits, and matters of state.
So starting from this, I think, very interesting idea of angels or spiritual entities as the rulers of nations. I think for me, when I discuss this, I'm speaking mainly from the Judeo-Christian perspective. So in the book of Daniel, you will find a description of nations being at war, and these nations are led by angels.
Okay.
And I think that it's a very, very, it seems like a sort of mind-boggling concept, but the way that I see it is that if you think of an institution that over time has particular traditions that solidify or ways of thinking, a value system, and over time these things become kind of actually real or more real and tangible, and it sort of takes on a life of its own.
Mm-hmm.
So an institution, when I say institution, it could be a church, big C or little c,
Yeah.
The nation, a nation, a conglomerate. These things will develop or will acquire a presiding deity, some kind of overarching, as I said before, value system or agenda that becomes quite dogmatic.
Okay.
And it's at that point that I think you can start speaking about angels or some other almost like an over or quite literally superhuman thing that basically acts for its own interest in everything. So if you're, an example could be if you're, let's say, you get your law degree, you get into the system, you become a bureaucrat, you're working in Congress for a while, you move on to the White House. The White House has its own overarching system. There's I'm not going to say the deep state, but there are people that have been there for years and years and years. And even before then, there's this overarching set of philosophies or just a common understanding of this is the way things work, this is the way that we do things.
Mm-hmm.
And that in a way is separate. It can be separate from the functioning of the individual, if you catch my drift.
Yeah.
And that becomes, in one way, a kind of angel.
So in terms of defining what an angel is, like so we're talking about this in a different way, say, from the Judeo-Christian version of, or indeed kind of Islamic concept of a being created from light by God. How does that?
Yes, I mean there's certainly. So yes, what I've just described is one way of interpreting what I think is this kind of angelic concept when it comes to nation states.
Right.
But of course, you do have the alternate. If you become, like, if you were to be a biblical literalist, and you can say, yes, these are you know, beings that have been put there by God
Mhm.
for a particular reason, for a particular function. But it's also interesting to look at it from the perspective of it being actually uh, sort of like if you think about again to come back to something like in the Bible, mammon, which is a kind of personification of greed, but it's also viewed as a god.
Mhm.
It's and when you get statements like in Ephesians talking about Satan as being prince of the power of the air,
Mhm.
was sort of basically in control of all of the world itself,
Right.
that the principalities and so on and so on and so on. It's fascinating to think about it in that way, and that actually, if you want to talk about the effect of like from a political standpoint, if you want to talk about how things happen in the world, how decisions are made, are they made by individuals or are they made through a system? Because at the highest level, these things are done
Yeah.
through groups, and often through groupthink, through very, very, very almost like conclaves, or not conclaves, but sort of collectives that will be thinking in a particular way. Obviously, there is diversity of thought, but
Mhm.
once you're in this once you come underneath this roof, it's almost as if there's Durkheim would say there's a collective. The French sociologist Durkheim, 19th century sociologist, would call this a kind of collective effervescence, a
Right.
collective consciousness, as opposed to like what Carl Jung would say, the collective unconsciousness. But that's another concept. But yeah, I know it does sound a bit funny to hear about it, to hear this kind of
Yeah, that kind of terminology.
conceptualization. Yeah.
So I mean, the the term that I've heard kind of used for that for kind of roughly that kind of concept as being egregore.
Yes.
Um, but,
Yes.
but,
That's
but
exactly.
certainly when you look at an organization, when you look at kind of we've all worked in companies or in organizations that have a specific culture. That
Mm.
culture often is defined by a particular set of characteristics, a particular set of habits, of values. Where do they come from? You could argue that they're written by HR, but the ones that are written by HR tend not to align with the actual values, the actual behaviors of an
Mm.
organization. So I think there's something to that, and people do become like that, like the organization that they join after a while. If it doesn't work, obviously they move on. But people who resonate with a place, and I guess they start to adopt those values and adopt those ways of thinking. And
No, of course. And I think that as well, if you think about the word, like again, this speaking from a Judeo-Christian perspective, or even from one perspective within the Judeo-Christian tradition,
yeah,
if you think of the world as being where the rulers or basically at the highest level,
hmm
there being a kind of spiritual reality over everything,
yeah,
and that this is a demonic again, not daimonic, but a demonic reality where you have again spirits in charge of on overhead, above heads of state and so on. You could think of it as an organization that becomes powerful enough or that lasts long enough, begins to acquire, again, over time, it gets larger and larger, more powerful. I mentioned before, church, big C, Catholic Church, whatever you want to, like, whatever you could call it, within its Scientology or any kind of organized institution, which gets very, 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 very large, and it kind of builds over time, taking on taking on all this energy, this
right,
kind of that's accreting, and it almost sort of, you could even say that it attracts a spirit or spirits to it, and those become
yeah,
its presiding entities. Again, this is all sort of just theoretical stuff, theoretical musings, but it's interesting to think about it in that way.
Well, if you look at like look at magical tables, look at things like, you know, the Liber 777 and the correspondence tables in there. There's loads of angelic correspondences. You know, they reside over days, the week, you know, reside over planets, all kinds of different things. And planets indeed reside over aspects of our culture, you know, time, you know, Saturn and time, and legal systems and authoritative systems, that kind of thing. So, you know, it makes sense that there's enough collective human energy that forms the kind of the basic, creates the energetic charge that something can then actually use that to power itself and become an entity, become a consciousness of sorts. Certainly when you look at things like egregores, and I guess the kind of subset or kind of circular, orbiting concepts, like things like tulpas, you know, they are artificial beings that are in effect created by intention and then fueled by either a predetermined magical sustenance of some kind, or as you say, they are sustained by collective energy, sustained by the energy of a group of people with a set of beliefs and a set of values that are of, well, they provide some kind of sustenance to this being, you know, be it angel or archon, whatever that.
Oh yeah, and it's also when the decisions that we make as individuals on a daily basis, there's always this feeling that we're doing what we're doing because we want to do that, but we're obviously susceptible to various pressures all around us, you know, various forces and things with, you know, overt and covert forces.
Yeah.
And again, that's where things like propaganda comes into it. You know, propaganda, which many would say is a form of black magic, and black magic in the sense of, well, let me roll that back. So propaganda itself, I think, is not something that is good or bad.
Right.
However, when you get it used, when it's used in a way to manipulate opinion,
Yeah.
to manipulate sways of people, and to create conflict between individuals, I think then, yeah, it can become a kind of black magic. And again, I say black magic because it can be covert, it can be subtle.
Right.
And one way that some occultists will describe black magic is or magic, let's just say magic in general, is sort of a subtle way of not only influencing oneself, but also influencing the behavior of others, and in doing so, influencing policy. And by influencing policy, you influence reality. You know, you influence the way that people will actually experience life.
Yeah.
You know, whether you're living in a particular neighborhood or whether you're living, you know, wherever, you know, your income, all these sort of things, all affect your well-being.
Yeah, and it's a really valid point. I mean, like if you look at any of these things objectively, you know, if you look at the idea of your nationality, your culture, your religious beliefs, your political beliefs, you look at them all objectively, it's very hard to see any of them really stand up as being, you know, that different to anybody else's. It's understanding that we are, to a certain extent, just running software based on on where we've been born or what framework we grew up in. These things are basically interchangeable, and we have the ability to kind of change dramatically in terms of our, like, what we might see as being integral, immutable behavioral patterns can totally change just by moving place, being exposed to a different culture. And I think, like for example, I mean, like, obviously I'm not from the UK. I live here. You sound like you're not from the UK, John. I don't want to make any assumptions, but like, certainly a lot of my views in terms of what being Irish means, living over here, have changed. Things that I probably would have been not so movable on. I'm probably a lot more movable on now, and I think those things are I think those things are really indicative of the exposure to influence, whatever those influences might be. If they're like on that kind of grandiose scale of and some kind of energetic super being that's manipulating us at a state level for whatever reason, maybe, as we were saying earlier, its own sustenance or whatever objective it might have. I think that's entirely a possibility. You'd often hear about people talking about kind of like, the archonic forces at work that lead us into things like global wars or global recessions and that kind of thing. So,
yeah,
the belief being that the negative energy, you've heard the term loosh being used, that kind of that negative energy that's generated from traumatic events that are on kind of a global or national level are a form of kind of sustenance,
yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, again, and I should have said this at the beginning, but I don't have any, my views are not set in stone. So a lot of what I discuss is just on a purely theoretical basis. And I'm a bit of a, well, I think like most occultists are syncretists, and we kind of like weigh different views and different outlooks. And I think, yeah, it's all this stuff. It's very interesting to discuss because I think it also comes down to observation. Our experiences, the things that we like. I have a background in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and so then I tend to look at things through that kind of lens, even though I've studied other traditions, I've participated in other traditions. I always tend to come back to these kind of archetypes and conceptualizations that you find within this very, very rich mythology and, poetic mythology. And yeah, just to come back to influence, and to come back to what I said before about groupthink. I think particularly in this day and age, you can really see, or you can really, for those who have a background or an interest in occultism or esotericism, you can really see how certain strategies that are being used now within governments, whether they're like either clandestine strategies or more overt things, are used to, like, we had many years back, not so many years back, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and it was very much about the subtle manipulation of thought, not hypnosis or anything like that, but using statistics or analytics and other behavioral things that come from behavioral psychology. But to Renaissance occultists or to medieval occultists or medieval ritualists, magical ritualists, we would look at those things as they would look at those things as magical things. It's basically like how Paracelsus, for example, he wrote, I think, a book on what he calls the invisible diseases, which are which is mental illness and mental things that aren't readily visible to the eye, or aren't visible at all to the eye. Invisible. He called them invisible diseases. And again, invisible manipulation. This is magic at its best, really, or let's say sorcery at its best, because it manipulates without the knowledge of the person.
Oh yeah,
without the knowledge of that's the thing.
Well, if you look at, like, I mean, you made the point about kind of propaganda. Excuse me. And if you look at kind of like the the more iconic pieces of propaganda art, like the classic as a Kitchener, your country needs you, or Britain needs you, that kind of thing. Like it's literally convincing people to die for a concept, to die for the state. And I mean, I'm not laughing at that in a glib way. I'm just thinking it's so preposterous, a thing that that could happen to an individual. Such was terrible thing that could happen to an individual, but it works. Like these ideas and these concepts, people will kill for them. People will die for them.
Absolutely. And I think that's it. I'll let you. You were on something. I cut you off.
No problem. It's when I think about like concepts of like like in Ireland, we around the time of the real rise in Irish nationalism, 100 years ago, and just over 100 years ago, there was the idea of Mother Ireland, who had 4 green fields, which are the 4 provinces of Ireland, and they were in bondage and all this kind of stuff, and was seen as this poor old decrepit woman, which was a visualization or a metaphor for the state of Ireland. And then the idea was this young, beautiful, proud woman walking down the road, and through the action of revolution and military force and the assertion of sovereignty through arms, the elderly, decrepit woman would transform into the young, beautiful, proud representation of Ireland. And these are I mean, to a certain extent, I think all these metaphors are somehow reflective of an egregoric state, an energetic state, like the material end. So what, so to speak? Do you know what I mean? Like they're the condensed, dense versions of these things.
No, I mean, I think that's a great point, and I think it also reflects, in my view, what I see is very important in magic and just as a general outlook, that the fact that emotion is always more powerful than reason, than rationality, and it is emotion, it is irrationalism that moves people. It is irrationalism that will send people into horrible situations, into great situations as well. But it's a prime motivator, and for the sorcerer, that can affect one's psyche in that way. That is a very, very amazing thing to comprehend. I mean, this is why the Stoics are very, the Stoics, and I think also the many of the post Platonists are very much insistent on this idea of ensuring that there is this awareness that you have to be aware of the power of opinion, the power of externals to affect our well-being. And I think this is something that you also find as you know, and that you will also find in occultism, that you need to reach a point in order to be an effective practitioner. You need to reach a point where you're not enslaved to the passions. Right. Not that you're not affected, not that you're not affectionate, or that you're not passionate about certain things, but that you're not a slave to it. Because the minute you become a slave to something, the minute that thing can push you into certain various circumstances, like, you know, a conglomerate or the church or whatever, then you come under the influence of not only your peers, but whatever other forces are out there, you know, whatever other higher beings, or, you know, who may be drawing on from that. You also get this concept in I believe it's, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. I'm always struggling with these Greeks. Iamblichus.
That's you're doing very well. I mean, yes. I regularly get comments just going, that is not even remotely how that word is pronounced. You know, all the time, you know. And,
yeah.
And they're
yes. Yeah.
Correct. You're doing really well.
Okay. But yeah, Iamblichus. It's so he, in his On the Mysteries, he speaks about and now the quote is escaping me, but it was something about elevating oneself through the power of rational persuasion. I think that the term is, the way it's translated in English, it's like the power of rational persuasion, because again, in this cosmology, in his sort of cosmology, you have the gods that are sort of controlling physical reality. They are in charge of the physical cosmos, but you can become higher than certain lower beings, certain I guess demonic would be the wrong word to say, but let's just say lower celestial beings.
Right.
By using your power by being able to negate and overcome the elements, you know, to rise above the elements. When I say elements, I also mean not, you know, just not physical matter, but like the elemental,
right?
The emotional. So I think these are also concepts which relate to what I was saying about the higher angelic beings who are in charge of, or the earthly beings who are supposedly in charge of the governments and nations,
right?
And times and periods, like, you know, this zeitgeist kind of stuff.
Right. Well, speaking of kind of zeitgeist, there's a concept. I'm trying to kind of recall what it is, but there's a concept of a kind of an embodiment of plague, and it's a female embodiment of plague. I can't remember the exact phrase is, whether it's like ladies of the plague or plague ladies. And there was this idea of in medieval Europe, when the plague was in full swing, the Black Death rather, that these figures would turn up, and basically these female figures would denote the plague was going to arrive, and it was kind of an immediate effect. One of the things I found quite interesting was how the internet spun up a character called Corona-chan pretty much in January. I think it was like a 4chan thing. And Corona-chan was this kind of anime portrait of an Asian woman who was the embodiment of Corona. And that, you know, that meme took on a life of its own. So it kind of reminded me of the same thing. It's like this kind of like embodiment of this disease then has an actual physical representation
Mm.
in this form. It's weird the way those things tend to occur in time. They recur quite regularly, which is it's a weird thing, because we always think of, I mean, this podcast aside, but we always think of Western thinking and ourselves as being fairly empirical, fairly, rational. Like this supernatural, preternatural are not part of the daily life of the majority of the Western world. That's a perception. It's kind of a collective understanding. It's not remotely true.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a view of itself. And these things still turn up. These kind of concepts, these memes, these ideas will still capture the imagination.
Yes, absolutely. But I slightly disagree with you in that, on the face of it, let's just say in my experience, yes, on the face of it, most people will be or seem to be unwilling to discuss or speak about the supernatural and things of that nature. But I find that often I'll say something along the lines of, like, if I'm meeting new people, I'll say, what do you have any ghost stories? And surprisingly, I'd say like 95% of the time people are talking about strange experiences that they've had. Now, I'm not hanging around occultists all the time, of course.
Yeah.
But bankers, doctors, and so on, and it's very much that. Yeah, I feel like it's this supernaturalism or semi-supernaturalism is always like in the closet. In the West, we like to say, yeah, we're very much, as you said, an empirical society, post-enlightenment, blah 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 blah. But yeah, I do think that these things are there in the closet. And then when you have the brilliant thing that you just mentioned, was it Corona Chan, things like that, when they kind of surface, it's almost as if it's sort of the unconscious side of us is sort of constantly operating. And it's like even any other memes like that you will find. I mean, memes are being constantly generated on a daily basis, and it's really, really amazing to see how these things work and spread, and why they spread, and at a particular time and place, and then what things actually last.
Yeah, totally. And I think the way you describe it there as being kind of supernatural ism or experiences are in the closet it's a really nice way of describing it. It's that face that's presented outwardly that tends to hide.
Absolutely.
I agree with you completely in that regard. Going back to the idea of states or nations, or indeed anything that has a kind of a collectivist energy behind it, that big thing becoming conscious, that fascinates me. Be it angel, be it egregore, be it archon, because I mean, you look at kind of archons. We think of those as kind of age-old forces, and there's different types of archon, right? And you look at kind of, we look at from an astrological point of view, we talk about kind of the age of Aquarius, the age of Taurus, etc., etc. So I think that concept has been there for time immemorial, but it's not it's not articulated. It's not kind of going. We never talk about it in terms of like, this is actually what's happening. So I think it's interesting to kind of shine light on it in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, for me, I look at it and say, like, look, like, let's take a step, let's stand aside and take a step back and just throw at everything. Like, let's not be dogmatic. Let's not, let's look at it, say, for example, from an atheistic perspective or whatever, and look at these things and say, look, when you join, or whenever this institution started, whenever this corporation started, it was like X, and then all these other people joined it, and it still was like X. And when those people talk about the future of, I mean, they talk about, well, the organization needs this, the organization needs that, the organization needs X, Y, and Z, and we're going to do this because the organization will. So it's almost as if I think I mentioned Durkheim before, where he speaks about, well, for him, he talks about collective effervescence as being like the society itself, with all its mores and practices, becomes a kind of god. Everybody makes decisions in reference to society, or in reference to whatever group they're part of. So speaking from that perspective, where we're not like, so let's say as I said before, like either an atheist, non-theist perspective, you can still say that at a certain point, the larger this organization gets, the more it becomes like a living being that has its own interests. And actually, those interests become hostile to the individuals. So it's, it is really fascinating to think about it that way. And I think it's something that, as you suggested before, most people don't really think about it that way. But if you're a junior official, or some kind of aide or something in the government, whether you're based out of the White House or based out of Westminster or whatever, and you join this community, and this community has traditions, or you join a gentleman's club, or you join whatever it is, and these traditions have been there for years and years and years and years and years, influencing on and on and on and on the members of that community. And when that institution or that body actually does things in the world, does things that affect hundreds, thousands, millions of people, I think at that point, even if you're an atheist, or even if you completely don't care about religion at all, you can say that it is a kind of a god, because it's I guess it's also a poetic way of looking at war of the gods, or all these nations battling each other, and at the top of the food chain are these kind of disparate entities that
And and you look at it and you can think, well, there's also like belief systems. When you think about, like, just in Europe alone, all the battles between Catholicism and the various strands of Protestantism. I mean, they would have been hugely egregoric. And the same in confrontations in political ideologies.
Absolutely. And the other interesting thing that has come to my mind is, often when we see something that becomes seemingly too big to fall, the only way that it does fall, or that it does change, is either through a mutation of soul, or a mutation of state. Now, mutation of soul, revolution, huge movement of the masses in a particular direction, a huge upheaval. And a mutation of state is a kind of like some kind of catastrophe. That kind of disrupts. If you look at, again, this is all coming from a Western viewpoint, but the two oldest gods in Greek mythology. So I think, according to Homer, or the oldest god is chaos. But then if you look at other people like Parmenides, you'll find the oldest god is Eros. But if you say, let's say these are the two oldest gods, chaos and Eros, which is desire. And it's almost like you can view chaos as this thing like mutations of state, and Eros as like mutation of soul. its desire, its passion, its this kind of very, very visceral thing that can change things. Um, and the same with chaos. Like there's this randomness that can break things up very, very rapidly, can completely annihilate, completely destroy,
Right.
completely uproot an institution. And I think you could even these are godlike entities, godlike concepts that are before everything else.
Mm-hmm. That it's a massive idea, isn't it? When you really sort of think about it, it's huge. I mean, I think the bit for me that's really interesting as well is that if these things are created by, or the protein of growth comes from a collectivization of an idea that gets energy through belief. What are they before that? What is it? Is there an empty, kind of amorphic consciousness which is able to latch on to this, or sort of ingest that energy and become a thing, start to become,
I think,
reflected back?
as I see it, there are two. I mean, there of course could be many ways of looking at it, but as I see it, there are two ways of looking at it. Either there are objectively, either there are, either there are entities that objectively exist that prey on lower beings and will be attracted to movements that become institutions and become huge things with like a lifespan of like thousands of years. So I mean, I keep mentioning the Catholic Church, but yeah, that is lifespan of that period of time, and they will cling on to those. And then the other possibility, as I see it, is that there is a polytheism, but everything is our creation. Every single entity that has come into existence was created through this sort of concerted effort,
Mm-hmm.
will and volition, and these things, they take on a life of their own.
Mm-hmm.
You come up with a history of ideas. There's just so many different philosophies and concepts, and you know different forms of poetic things based on poetics, things based on aesthetics, and so many things that are just flying around now. And you have somebody who, like, for example, the Renaissance humanists were hugely influenced by ideas by like classical authors like Seneca and Cicero, and it's these ideas that kind of also that influenced the early modern era. So these Renaissance humanists take on these very, very old ideas and kind of breathe new life into them.
Okay.
And if we think about gods in this way, that there are already these ideas flying around, flying off the covers of our books and so on. It's just, so there's this constant, and we're constantly engaging with deities that were created by our ancestors, but that exist somewhere in the kind of stratosphere. And like you may have a guy who, he grows up in the hood, or he grows up in some kind of any particular, and any neighborhood or somewhere in Alaska or whatever, and for some reason he's attracted to a particular philosopher or a particular theoretician or whoever in Spain or in Timbuktu, or for some reason he's drawn to that person. He can't explain it, but he's drawn to that person. And it's almost as if like that God, or whatever that philosopher, whatever that historian developed, that entity, that idea, is attracting somebody to reformulate that and kind of spread it into promote it again, or to kind of take a new to reinterpret it.
Mm-hmm. It's getting its next incarnation, maybe. What I was going to say to you is thinking about the idea of when you've got kind of a major belief system, be it political, be it religious, whatever. When we talk about characteristics of that and values, but there's also behaviors, certain behaviors and patterns that are designed, to be a good Catholic. I mean, I grew up Catholic as well, so it's in there. The behaviors were obviously idealization of Jesus Christ, the really kind of the total. Like in Ireland, there was a massive Mary cult as well. Mary's massive in Ireland. With the marrying year in the 60s, there's these shrines got built all over the country. Everywhere you drive in the middle of nowhere, you could be driving for miles and not see anybody save cows, and you'll see Marian shrines in the middle of nowhere. Huge figure in the country.
Yeah.
It's always been a goddess worshipping country, so it's got that there. But I always see kind of Mary as kind of she's like a circumcised version of the goddess. She's really had her sexuality removed from her, yet she still produces the child. So we have the archetype of males have the archetype of Jesus to emulate, and females have a corrupted version of femininity with no sexuality. And that behavior where sex becomes completely inverted and becomes a thing that is solely for procreation only, and that kind of all forms of human sexuality outside procreation and in marriage. Certainly when I was growing up in the 90s, that was the subtext of it. It is a perversion, or it is an act against God, and then the kind of levels of guilt that come off that. So that creates, that's like, it's counter to biological imperatives and all the hormonal awakenings of teenagers, generations of Irish teenagers.
Yeah,
but it generates that energy of guilt, fed by sexual energy, which is our engine of gnosis, and it's corrupted.
I completely understand. You're absolutely right. I mean, you hit the nail on the head right there. It's you feel, and that's exactly what Durkheim discusses. Because growing up in that context, you do something that's considered out of order. Mm-hmm. You actually feel it within you, as if there is something over your, like right on your shoulder. Like nobody has to know. You know yourself, right? Mm-hmm. But you feel this tremendous guilt. And it's because of this, deep down, there's this dedication, or there's this connection to that entity, or that entity that is actually in effect, speaking, we're discussing again the Catholic Church here, mm-hmm. an entity that has been created mm-hmm. by over, through a very, very bureaucratic process over the centuries, and which is obviously different from what you'll find in early Christianity.
Oh yeah, totally.
So that's why I think it exemplifies how legitimate it is to discuss, to articulate to describe this kind of feeling mm-hmm. as a divinity, because it seems superhuman, mm-hmm. in that there's something invisible. Mm-hmm. People will say, "Oh, it's my conscience," but actually, you grew up in this tradition, and it's that tradition that is having an effect on you.
Yeah.
So whether you grow up Muslim, or you grow up Jewish, or you grow up, in some other Orthodox tradition, or Hindu or whatever, particularly at the level, if you grow up in a tradition that's dogmatic, you will always have this sensation. and I think that's the word you used before is the egregore. And but yeah, I'd say it's the divinity that either exists objectively or has been created and has gained power through these millennia
Yeah.
of through the ages.
Yeah, and it is really interesting. I mean, when you talk about kind of existing, kind of objectively or created, I mean, you look at Thelema, for example. So you have the whole kind of the Book of the Law and Iowas and Crowley's Amaranta working, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and engagement with Iowas and Lamb. And you have a whole religion come from a being. The whole book is downloaded, and the Telemites all over the world looking at it and following the tenets as they're laid out within Thelema and from Crowley's subsequent work. So there seems to be then evidence of a being that has interacted with people, and then you look again at kind of all the the Abrahamic religions. You have the same thing. Angels turn up and talk to Mary. You're going to have a child. Like these interactions happen in most of our major religions. A being turns up, and then something miraculous happens, and there's a religion, and those religions then have a set of tenets and behaviors. Mormonism is the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's whether they're objective or they're objective things, and then they get fed by the energy. It's hard to say.
Really again, you're absolutely right. Because you're actually hitting on another very, very important point, which is the concept of the genius, or there's this concept in occultism where supposedly everyone is assigned a kind of inner divinity, a kind of inner genius that will, and so in Crowley's case and in various other, you could say, mystics, at a certain point they'll be contacted by this personal daimon, or in the 19th century with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, they call it the something like the Holy Guardian Angel or something like that. But it's this, you're contacted by that, and then that will push you on to this path where you start a new religion. So it is again this question of like the chicken and the egg, because if we talk about organizations, hugely powerful organizations being being controlled by some kind of self-created divinity, then how do we discuss this idea of the genius? Because if it's the genius that actually puts you on a path to like if you're talking about Muhammad, and if we talk about Muhammad in the desert and him going into the cave and speaking to the angel Gabriel, and then all of a sudden over time founding this hugely powerful religion, it's then we could say, yeah, well, maybe it is in direct intervention by some kind of entity that is that wants to have its own energy source, or its own nation, or whatever. Or again, it's just like, are there certain people who have a particular disposition where they're able to, and again, I'm speaking from a kind of, at the moment I'm speaking from not an empirical perspective, but I guess I'm being very reductionist right now.
Yeah.
So if you have somebody who has a particular disposition where they are able to just connect with another side of themselves, and it's actually that disposition that puts them on that path.
Right.
That's another question. Actually, the Greek word for prophet is mantis, which means I am raving mad. Right. So it's really fascinating. You know, even if you look back and the kind of seems kind of Bronze Age times where you do have these miracle men, shamans, and prophets. These guys living in the world of today, how would we describe them? How would Westerners describe them? And it's very, very interesting.
Well, I mean, I imagine Westerners would describe it in a pretty negative light.
Yeah.
Someone says, "I'm hearing voices." First thing that comes to mind isn't "Tell me about it. I want to hear more." The first thing that comes to mind is someone's got serious mental health issues. And when you look at Islam and Catholicism as well, I mean, it's less so Catholicism. They don't really talk about kind of demonic forces and intrusions really anymore. But in Islam, it's still very much a living part of that tradition, where the concept of was or was, the idea of the whisperings of demons, the whispering of jinn, shaitan, particularly shaitans, trying to intrude on people and deviate them from the path of Allah. And within the Catholic tradition, very much the same thing. When terminology was used as obsession, the idea was that the devil and demons were there to try and tempt you from the path of Christ, to move you away from God. And ultimately, the idea is some kind of sanctioned trial, that it's a way of kind of testing one's mettle, or through suffering and trauma, that you actually learn the value of your faith in God, or the love of God, a Book of Job type thing. But it's a really interesting thing when you read through kind of the list of symptoms of, or indicators of was and obsession. I mean, they read exactly like a list of mental health issues. I mean, they're interchangeable, really. Which is, I did a video about this a while ago, which was kind of raising the question. I mean, it's a tricky question. Obviously, mental health is a very sensitive issue, and rightly so. What if it is intrusion? We're not looking after people in any shape or form who are suffering from potentially some kind of parasitic intrusion. They're kind of a lower level.
It's a difficult question, but I think it's the mysteries of the psyche. I think a lot of what we experience is just reality. I mean, I'm questioning daily experience. I'm very, very skeptical about various things, and I think that it's an approach that can be rewarding as well, because sometimes you're able to just step back and kind of admire the mystery. And for me, it's very difficult to speak dogmatically about anything. I mean, there's so many different occult traditions, so many different occult practices, and you mentioned the OTO and things of that nature. I mean, Aleister Crowley was really remarkable and frightening figure, actually. Quite a frightening figure.
Yeah.
Highly intelligent, highly astute, and clearly he was in contact with powerful beings. Whether those beings were within him or elsewhere, who knows? But really an amazing figure. But even him, he was, as I understand it, he struggled with being dogmatic about certain things. Right. And of course, that's That's the way things go.
No, I mean it's challenging territory. You know, it's it, there's always challenges.
You mentioned before, and I've got actually a somewhat personal question for you. You don't have to answer.
Sure.
Are you within, or do you follow a particular tradition?
I I I do. Yes.
I can see you pressing the delete button now. It's just like, okay, eraser.
So I am. I'm a Thelemite, but I'm only a baby one. You know, I'm interested in a lot of different traditions, really. You know, kind of my personal makeup of what I engage with. I kind of gravitate a lot more towards really folk magic. Speaks to me a lot more, really. You know, kind of I guess kind of the American equivalent of like hoodoo, root work, and stuff.
That's right.
So yeah, that kind of would be kind of a lot of my day-to-day practice. But I am learning about kind of, I guess, more high magical concepts through Telema, studying them.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah. So,
and
but as
I do have a follow-up question to that.
Yes.
Would you say that the transition, because you spoke about growing up in the Catholic Church, did the transition come about through some kind of randomness or kind of chaotic experience? Did chaos intervene, is what I'm trying to say.
I think really for me where kind of doubt started was really just in the kind of the conflicts within the church.
Right.
Like you were told one thing, but people behaved in a very different way. And that tension always threw me. It always kind of unsettled me. And then kind of, like we discussed earlier, the view of human sexuality, I think, was always difficult. But in terms of like how I got to the position I am, or in the belief system, yeah, totally random, totally chaotic. You know, like I mean, really, how I got to even know where or to know any Thelemites to contact and to speak to, you know, was through Treadwell's and Christina kindly responding to me approaching her with my photographic work and being gracious enough to point me in some different directions. So I mean, entirely random, really.
Yeah, I think Christina as well. I think she is magnificent.
Oh yeah.
I mean, Treadwell's is. I mean, they'll be writing books about the place in 50 years. It's really a nucleus of.
Well, I mean,
you know,
there's an egregore there as well. I think, to be honest, there's a degree of kind of like there's a big Treadwell family, you know, and it's international. You know.
Oh yeah.
Like
no, absolutely.
There's one of those things. If someone says to me, "Oh yeah, I really like Treadwells," I'm like, I automatically assume they're a good person. You're probably a good person, anyway. So if you're listening, Christina, we like you.
Yeah. No, it's a great place, and actually, it's in terms of the psychogeography, it's right there in Bloomsbury,
yeah,
where Bohemians and all kinds of very, very interesting people had assembled for.
Yeah.
So it's really, really a great place. Lots of lovely people coming in and out, and Christina is really she's huge influence on many different communities in the UK.
Oh yeah,
and abroad.
yeah, she's very important in the in a cult culture within the UK, and as you say, abroad. On a slightly different turn, we spoke earlier about the CIA reports into the Soviet Union use of black magic. Do you want to talk to that a little bit before we wrap up?
Yeah, I just say that it doesn't surprise me. I mean, we've known about the Stargate. I mean, the Stargate project is public knowledge. And I don't know if you've seen the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats.
Yeah.
So I mean, it doesn't surprise me that people people at the highest level of government are or have been and are interested in this kind of manipulation, because they know, and in fact any illusionist will tell you that, or any mentalist will tell you that, yeah, there are hidden forces. People are influenced. You've got, what's it called, NLP, neuro linguistic programming is what they.
Yeah.
You've got all these different kind of strategies and techniques and things that have actually been around for years and years and years and years. And at the most practical level, it's something that, like, used cars.
Yeah.
It sounds bad for me to say, but like a used car salesman, or some kind of salesman or a marketer or whatever, these kind of techniques are readily employed by people like that. Just persuasive techniques.
Mm-hmm.
So I think with this report, they were discussing something about, I mean, if I remember it correctly, I haven't looked at it recently, but I think certain spies, Soviet members of the psychonauts, or alleged sorcerers or something in the days of the Soviet Union, were apparently training to, or this is actually what the U.S. said, that they were training to basically blow up things remotely with their minds. And there's actually a legitimate, if you look at these documents, there's actually legitimate fear that that this is real. But I think at the same time, with that, and with all these documents coming out now, the Cold War is quite interesting, because you see also the power of propaganda, the power of, like, false stories, of actually fake news, and things that were used to go back, with particularly these two nations going back and forth with one another and saying, oh, well, we're doing this, and no, we're doing this, and kind of to get people constantly questioning, and also trying to frighten each other, to say, oh, well, we're experimenting with psionics, or we're experimenting with telekinesis and things like that. And then on the flip side, then the other nation will say, oh, we're doing the same thing. And it kind of becomes this war of ideas.
Yeah, okay. Psychic arms race.
Yes, an arms race. That's the right term for it. Psychic arms race. But yeah, I think certainly more things will come out in the next few years. But sure. I think there's always another angle to it, in that.
Well, yeah, I think
that there may be these psychic powers that are legitimately being, that there are these legitimate experiments and so on. But on the other side, like, as part of a propaganda operation, there's also something that's there. I mean, I think it was, who was it? Is it Mark Pilkington? Mark Pilkington, is that his name? He did a documentary. I think he's with Stranger Press. He did a documentary a few years ago on like UFOs.
Okay.
And how that there were elements of that factored into United States propaganda.
Well, I think one of the things from all of these revelations is that, well, if the governments are taking it seriously, then maybe so should we. The government probably don't want us to take it seriously or be aware of it if it's latent human capability. But it shows that we should be looking at it. Anyway, Jonah, that has been an hour, I think a bit over an hour. So thank you very much for your contribution to the new podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you for bearing with me. I know at points I can be meandering.
Oh, so. Listen, you're in good company. At least you're coherent. Which is more I can say for myself. So hopefully we can get you back again at some stage.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've got some amazing material on your blogs. Speaking of which, where's the best place for people to find you?
You can find me on thethinkersgarden.com or Godfrey's Almanack.org, and both just feature. I try to bring out. I've been kind of on hiatus for the past few months, but I'm trying to bring out short articles and also interviews, and I always try to release new things or things that have been overlooked. So yeah, definitely come have a look.
And certainly I'd like to echo that, is that Jonah's subject matter, some of it is really, really remarkable and really well researched. As it's quite clear and evident from listening to him. He knows what he's talking about. So I really recommend going out and having a look at his work. Jonah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for appearing on Spirit Box, and we'll talk soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jared.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonah. I hope you guys all enjoyed the show. If you did, and you're watching on YouTube, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you're listening on the podcast, there should be a call-in function. If you feel impassioned to call and leave a comment, by all means do. Okay, take care. Talk soon. Bye.